Let me begin by welcoming everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is an international webinar. And I'm John Gannon, Executive Director of the Global Justice Resource Center. Here at the center, we are seeking innovative ways to implement justice in a new key ideas, new key practices, and a new key or new tone to the conversation about justice reform. Certainly, if we've been at reform for over 3 centuries and we're still complaining about idleness and overcrowding and racial disparities and inmate abuse, we need justice in a new key. Maybe some of the folks that are listening today will want to get involved. Call me, email me, we'll connect. So I'm hosting this first webinar in our takeaway series, which is a series that's specifically designed to assure that everybody gets to take away at least 3 to 5 ideas from the presenters. As host of the webinar, I'd like to lead off with an exciting takeaway and new key idea in value-added justice. We're the center for this new approach to constructive change in criminal justice. And value-added justice is a multi-layered approach to transforming criminal justice practices around the world. It's culturally independent, nonpartisan, atheoretical, and a principled conceptual framework for change. It comprises aspirational goals, means of communication, and methods of collaboration to achieve transformation of justice practices and policies wherever concerns for human rights, human dignity, fairness, and the rule of law are concerned. Virtually every policy and practice has a casualty rate. That is, in human life, there are few, if any, policies or practices that don't have a downside for somebody. Some of these are inevitable factors arising from the nature of life on our planet. We don't usually think of it this way, but for example, if you get a parking spot next to the door, everybody else has to park further away. Good for you, but not so good for the others. This seems to be the order of things in many instances, but other situations harm people unnecessarily. The outcomes may be good for some people, maybe even for a lot of people, but they may also have a high casualty rate. That is, they may harm people unnecessarily. For example, if we remove a burglar from the community, it would have helped the innocent victims of his future burglaries. But if we impoverish his family, interrupt the education of his children, and lead his wife to divorce him, we create other innocent casualties, and the net value to society may actually become negative. At the Global Justice Resource Center, we don't believe that making communities worse should be an acceptable practice for any social institution. So value-added justice is concerned with casualty rates and making things better. Of course, we need more now than perhaps ever to acknowledge that whatever the good that we do with our policing and incarceration policies and practices, but we also need to examine and minimize unnecessary harm. The formula for value-added justice is simple. It's G minus H plus C, which just means the good you do, consider the harm you cause, and add the change you can bring to increase the good, decrease the harm, or both. We believe that the measure of success of our criminal justice policies and practices should be the net good we accomplished for our communities. High rates of good, low rates of harm, and flexibility to make changes so that community well-being is consistently improved by our policies and practices. I've asked our panelists today to consider their remarks from a value-added perspective, if at all possible. And I'll be looking as forward as much as you are to the wisdom that they're going to share. Leading us off with an analysis of the current social and reform situation in the United States is Mark Maurer, Senior Advisor and former Executive Director of the Sentencing Project. Mark will be followed by historian Larry Sullivan, who will help us understand our current situation and our possibilities from a historical perspective. Larry will be followed by Phil Wheatley, the former Director General of Her Majesty's Prison Service in the UK, who will outline some of the potentials and challenges from the legal administrative side of the justice equation. Our last presenter will be Dr. Kenneth Ray. As a training consultant and federal court monitor, Dr. Ray will share some insights as a person at the crossroads of citizenry and legal process. Now, I don't see Dr. Agomo here. Dr. Agomo, have you joined us yet? Okay, then we will move on to our first presenter. I had asked Dr. Agomo to make a presentation for us to give some opening remarks as president of the Global Justice Resource Center. But as you know, some of the African countries have difficulty with the internet connections, so that may be the issue here. But our first presenter is Mark Maurer. Mark is an expert on sentencing policies in the United States. He's now senior advisor and was executive director of the Sentencing Project from 2005 until earlier this year. The Sentencing Project has been extremely influential in bringing racial disparities to the attention of the public and advocating for criminal justice reform in the United States. So let me turn it over to you, Mark.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, John, and I'm delighted to be here, and this is the right moment to be talking about these issues. You know, to begin, if we're thinking about public safety and criminal justice reform, let me tell a quick story about a friend of mine. My friend and his wife are parents to 3 teenage kids, 2 girls and a boy. And some time ago, their teenage son started acting like a teenage boy. So he was staying out late at night. He was doing probably some drinking or drug use, not excessive, but there was some concern. He smashed up the family car once. His grades were suffering in school. So it's nothing terrible, but my friends were concerned about him, where he was going. And one night they get a call from the police station. Their son has just been picked up for shoplifting from a local convenience store. And over the course of the next 2 weeks, his parents spent time talking first with the police, secondly with the prosecutor assigned to the case. And what they said was, you know, our son has been having problems. He knows it, we know it. We've found a social worker we think can help him through this period, and he seems amenable to doing that, and that's how we'd like to move forward with him. And the prosecutor said, well, it's his first arrest. It's a low-level crime. It sounds like you've got a good plan. So yes, we don't need to prosecute him, and we wish you good luck in working with the social worker. So he goes off and works with the social worker, and things are coming together very well. And it looks like he will have good opportunities to lead a nice middle-class life, however he chooses to do that. Now, on the same night that my friend's son was arrested, I would imagine not very far away, there was another young teenage boy arrested for the same crime, but this young man didn't have parents who had either the financial resources to get a social worker or the negotiating skills to deal with the prosecutor in the case. Now, you're not going to go to prison on your first shoplifting offense, of course, but you know, he'll get perhaps a misdemeanor conviction, have to do some community service work or pay some financial fine. And 6 or 12 months from now, he's caught breaking into a car or something like that. And all of a sudden, he starts to look like one of these habitual offenders, as we sometimes call them. So he's going down a very different path than my friend's son is going. So when we think about public safety, I think we want to think broadly in terms of what is the formal justice system doing, what resources do we as individuals or communities bring to these considerations, and how does that shape some of the outcomes we're thinking about. Here in the US, of course, we're in a situation of mass incarceration since the early 1970s. I'm sure most viewers know the broad outlines. We have 7 times as many people behind bars as we did in 1970. More than 2 million Americans caged in prisons and jails, enormous racial disparities. And if we want to try to undo this situation, to reverse this situation, I think we need some sense of how we got to be here. And there are particular policies and practices that explain much of it. I think the broader context relates to changing socioeconomic conditions in American society. Back around 1970, we had the beginnings of globalization and the decline of the manufacturing economy in the US. So we had parents who had good union wage jobs. Their sons and daughters are probably more likely to be working in a fast food place than in a union wage auto or steel plant today. We had the beginnings of growing inequality in the US, which is now grown to just enormous proportions and has all kinds of implications. So some very significant changes taking place that contributed in part to rising crime rates in the mid to late 60s and early 70s. Some of this was due to a number of factors like the baby boom generation coming of age. So the post-World War II baby boom, we now had more young men, in particular in the age group 15 to 24, and all things being equal, that demographic group is more likely to be involved in crime. We had increasing urbanization, which is often associated with higher rates of crime, high rates of Black youth unemployment, and a number of other factors. So we did have an increase in crime. The crime data from that period are not nearly as sophisticated as they are today, but they clearly show there was a rise in both violent crime and crime overall. So the question then became, well, how do we respond to this? What do we do about this? What's our approach to public safety? And normally we have a broad range of options in developing public safety strategy, which involves creating opportunities for young children to grow up in healthy environments. So it has to do with schooling and healthcare. It has to do with parental financial support, specialists to help with family problems as they come up, and also the criminal justice system. Well, what happened basically at that time was since the image of this rising rate of crime was in many ways the face of a young Black man or a young Black woman, the policy options to develop became very narrow, very much focused on policing and punishment to the exclusion of some of those other approaches that might have been taken. We see interesting research done here in the US looking at the relationship between race and the severity of punishment. And white respondents to survey questions, when asked what kind of punishment should be imposed in a particular case, to the extent that they view that crime as a so-called Black crime. In other words, one they believe Blacks are most heavily involved in, then support for punishment goes up in such cases. We see how these dynamics have played out in recent decades. The crack cocaine, powder cocaine sentencing disparities of the 1980s, far harsher punishments for crack cocaine. heavily used by African Americans at the time, then powder cocaine, which is much more whites and Latinos. We see it today. Today we have an opioid crisis that we're dealing with, and the public face of the opioid crisis is now a young white working class person typically. And while there are many punitive approaches being taken here, there's also much greater support for prevention and treatment interventions, certainly than we saw for the crack epidemic of the 1980s. Here in Washington, there's a university here, and I give a guest lecture there every semester to a class looking at criminal justice issues. And I often ask the students to give me some sense of, what drug use is like on their campus. And I ask them, don't tell me about yourself, tell me about your friends. How many of you have friends who've used illegal drugs? Every hand in the room always goes up. How rampant is drug use on your campus? Well, it's quite common on your campus. And then I say, well, you must be having drug raids every night if there's such heavy duty drug use going on here. And of course, they all start to giggle because rarely is there any kind of enforcement or legal intervention. And they usually understand why. They understand that society has an investment in them. They're college students 5 and 10 years from now. We expect them to be employed in good jobs. We expect them to be forming families and hopefully taking on leadership positions in the community. And so arresting them for a drug offense would really interrupt that. So a very different approach than we take to drug law enforcement in low-income communities of color in particular. So we have our situation of mass incarceration today, which involves, many different changes, but broadly speaking, it's been policies adopted at every level of government to send more people to prison and keep them there for longer periods of time. I think in recent years, we're in a modest reform movement of sorts that's taking place. There's been growing support for looking at alternatives to incarceration and trying to determine in which cases that may be appropriate. I think there's been less attention given to how much time people spend in prison, and increasingly, that's what's driving our enormous numbers, our enormous incarceration rate. At the Sentencing Project, we've been heavily engaged in looking at the issue of life imprisonment for a number of years now. Our most recent data show that now 1 of every 7 people in prison today is serving a life prison term. 1 of every 7, that's 200,000 people. Some with the possibility of parole, some without the possibility of parole. And as we look at the reform movement that's taken place in most states, a handful of states have achieved substantial reductions, 30 to 50% in some cases, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, California. In most states, the level of decline in the prison system is in the single digits or a little bit more. So here we have, in the last 20 years, a substantially declining rate of crime. One would ordinarily think we might see a corresponding reduction in incarceration to match that, but it doesn't come close to doing that. And I think much of the reason is because of who's excluded from consideration in the reform movement. Today, half the people in state prisons are serving time for a violent offense. Includes all the lifers I spoke about and many others, often serving decades in prison. And when people and policymakers hear someone's in for violent offenses, for many people, that's the end of the conversation. And I think that's a very unproductive way to think about it, because we do know that long prison terms are actually counterproductive for public safety. A couple of reasons in particular for that. One is that we've known for a long time that crime is a young man's game, as we used to say, that people age out of the high crime rate years. So involvement in crime rises quite steeply in the late teen years and early 20s, and this cuts across lines of race, class, and gender. But then involvement starts to decline quite substantially by the late 20s, 30s, and certainly by the late 40s, 50s, and 60s. So the person who gets a decades-long prison term for an armed robbery committed at 25, by the time he's 35, 45, or 50, in most cases is far less of a public safety risk than that 25-year-old was, which means that for each additional year we keep that person behind bars, we're getting diminishing returns for public safety, and it's coming at an increasingly higher cost, in large part because of the rising cost of health care for elderly people in prison. And elderly typically starts at the age of around 50 in terms of prison health care. So we're seeing these kinds of people piling up in prison, very little attention being given to them. And it also results in an enormous diversion of resources. So for every time we have to keep a individual locked up at the age of 50 or 60, often in declining health, that's enormous resources that are not going into working with the 14, 15, and 16-year-olds who are beginning to get involved in misbehaviors that could escalate over time, and for which we know there are interventions that can reduce their risk of involvement. So that's where we need to be going. I think in terms of reform movements and the moment we're in now, the COVID crisis in many ways is illustrated, the horror of incarceration today and concentrated populations behind bars, but it's also showed us potential for change. At the local jail level, many jurisdictions have reduced their jail populations by 30 and 40% for public health reasons, but it's also good criminal justice practice. Many of those people were in jail for no reason other than they couldn't afford money bail that was set in their case. And we're seeing some of this at the state prison level. It seems to me we want to seize the opportunity now, the moment of Black Lives Matters, first to do a real rethinking of public safety, rethinking of law enforcement, what mix of initiatives do we support to produce public safety, and where have we gone too far in terms of law enforcement's role. Secondly, I would advocate changes in our sentencing policies. I think we should adopt a maximum of 20 years in prison, except in unusual cases. Many nations in Western Europe, this is often the result either through legal standards or in practice, where it becomes rather unusual to keep people much longer than 20 years in prison. And thirdly, I would say we need to really go back to the concept of restorative justice, which has been around for several decades, has made some significant changes in certain areas in certain countries, but has never really achieved its potential of expanding to take on a much broader range of cases and individuals who are currently sentenced to incarceration today, but where we do have options. We do see programs that are doing some very creative, very important work in this area. So we're still facing a crisis, but we have opportunities presented by the grim COVID crisis. It's one area where we can try to make some changes for the better coming out of this difficult situation. So thanks for having me here, John. I look forward to the rest of our conversation. You're muted, John.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. That's excellent, and I really appreciate it. I see Dr. Agomo has joined us, and I wanted to incorporate her in our work here. We were going to, Uju, are you with us now?
Yes, I am. I am. I did not. I had the issue. I didn't. It was. Yes, I am with you. You know. Yes.
Okay. Well,
It was
Doctor,
the issue of the time. I wanted. I wasn't sure. I knew it. I had the correct timing, but it's okay.
I would like to introduce Dr. Uju Agomo, President of the Global Justice Resource Center and Executive Director of PRAWA, Africa's most prominent prisoner support and prison reform organization, for a few remarks. Dr. Agomo is known by reform leaders in Europe, throughout the African continent, and in many other places around the world as a leading figure and organizer of effective organizational change and in the treatment and management of criminal justice populations. So, Ujo, would you like to say a few words?
Okay. John, I think I don't know whether everybody's hearing me for connecting with the
We
Global
can
Justice
kind of
Resource
hear you.
Center for this very important initiative. Can you hear me?
We can kind of hear you. Go ahead. You're coming from a long
Are you
way.
hearing me, John? What did you say?
I said you're coming from a long way away, so it takes time to travel. But go ahead.
No, thank you very much, John. I just wanted to thank everyone who had joined this session. And I also think that this is a very, very important initiative, and a big thanks to John Gannon for really putting this together. Global Justice Resource Center, this is the kind of thing that the Global Justice Resource Center want to do and continue doing. I mean, connecting different professionals, connecting from different parts of the globe. So I'm really looking forward to a very interesting discussion. And as John said, we are all keen on terms of the kind of output that will come out from this particular discussion. As John has also mentioned, I am uh, connecting all the way from Abuja, Nigeria, so that's good. But again, as I said, there's a lot we need to learn from each other, and I'm really waiting to gain as much as possible from the discussion. One more time, I just want to thank everyone who have agreed to partner with the Global Justice Resource Center for this very, very important session. Thank you all. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Uju. Our next presenter is Dr. Larry Sullivan. Dr. Sullivan directs the operations of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice Library, which is the largest criminal justice library in the world. And he's editor in chief of the 3-volume Encyclopedia of Law Enforcement. So he's very knowledgeable about the law enforcement side, but he also teaches graduate courses and has published 10 books as an author, co-author, or editor, including Bandits and Bibles, Convict Literature in the 19th Century America, and the Brownsville Boys, Jewish Gangsters of Murder Incorporated. And of course, my favorite, the prison reform movement. So, Larry, if you take step up to the plate, take a few swings. Thanks.
Thank you, John. I know, can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, so I know that you said that it's your favorite book, The Prison Reform Movement, which I did go into a second edition, but you forgot the subtitle, which says Forlorn Hope.
I didn't forget it. I just didn't want to discourage people.
Well, Forlorn Hope, as we know, well, some people know, was a Greek battalion, ancient Greek battalion that went over the hill first, and not many people got back. And so I'm a little bit of an outlier on all of this. And I'm also a historian, so I'm going to try to give you about 5 centuries of prison reform and all its failures, and then give you a couple of maybe suggestions or observations after that. But one of my favorite poets is Francois Villon from the 15th century. And Francois Villon was a cutthroat, a burglar, and a great poet. So he was sitting in the Châtelet jail in Paris, waiting to get tortured and executed. Now, mind you, in those days, it was very simple. You went to jail for a little bit of time. You got banished, which was very, what can I say? When you say that you have a key to the city, it really meant something, because they did lock the doors at night, because if they push you out, they banish you out of the city, you could get wolves, eaten by wolves, etc., or then you got executed. So you got banishment, torture, and execution. So, but what happened to Villon, which is in one of his poems, is that the king came back from Vincennes, his chateau in Vincennes, and came to Paris, and they had a big cortege. And so what they did is they let everybody out of the prisons. The quality of mercy, which, you know, the whole mercy thing and pardons come from the Middle Ages, when a president or most governors can pardon crimes. All right, so Villon eventually disappeared, probably executed. Now this was 1462, etc. So it was very simple then. You have, you know, three things: banishment, torture, and execution. And a little bit of jail. They kept you in jail till they executed, etc., or it was a minor crime. Now, let me move on a little bit to the 17th century, when Michel de Montaigne, in his famous essays, and especially the one on repentance, says that there's nothing easier to fake than sincerity. So now this puts you in the realm of parole, probation, etc. All right, so that's in the 17th century. Now, mind you, the prisons were a little bit harsh in the 17th century too. The only, I guess, prison that we would call that was near the prisons we have today would be the monastic prisons. And when you talk about Jean Mabillon, the cleric who reformed monastic prisons, and much with solitary confinement. All right, so we'll go through. I'm skipping over to the 19th century, given my time frame. And you have the, really, I hate to say the birth of the prison, because I have a lot of problems with Foucault saying birth of the prison. However, but when you had Auburn prison and the Eastern Penitentiary, one with labor and congregate labor and solitude, Auburn in New York, and also the Eastern Penitentiary down by Philadelphia. These were prison reform movements, and they thought everything would be great. And much of this is based on religion. Almost all prison reform is based on religion, I think. And the Eastern Penitentiary, they would put you in a cell, and they would have a backyard, etc., where you could do labor. According to some of my studies, it took about 7 years to go crazy. Now, a later study in Germany said it only took 2 years to go completely mental in solitary confinement. So obviously this didn't work too well, even though it stayed through most of the 19th century, these types of prisons. And it was only in the 20th century, see, I did 3 centuries in 5 minutes. The 19th century, when California especially started the indeterminate sentencing. You had determinate sentencing. So you might stay for life. So California had indeterminate sentencing. I think it started in the 60s, early 70s. And New York took it up. And when I was working in the prison in Maryland, which was the late 70s, and quite frankly, this was the oldest penitentiary at the time, 1809 it was built. You had, I really don't think it was mass incarceration at that time. But you did have the average life sentence for murder was 11 years, an indeterminate sentence. And this is what we're talking about when I go back to Montaigne, when he talks about sincerity. My whole point in one of my books was that it's very difficult to teach a person to live in a free society in a cage. So in other words, all of the programs, and they had lots of programs in the Maryland Penitentiary in the 70s. You had classes, well, everybody had to take a GR, you had art classes, you had worked a wood shop, you had whatever. However, they would still get out. Most of them were murderers. I think I had 17 people working for me at that time, and the lightest sentence was 50 years. Most of them were in there for rape and murder. And so eventually most of them get out, but many of them were very upset with the indeterminate sentence because they never knew when they were going to get out. They wanted determinate sentences, and many went to what's called Patuxent Prison. I don't know if it's still there in Maryland, because it was a medical model where they figured that, well, if you look like you're being reformed, they would let you out rather in parole. All right, so what happened is the conservatives and liberals did not like, nor did the prisoners. I mean, if you read some of the excerpts I have in Bandits and Bibles, you will find out that the prisoners did not like determinate sentences or indeterminate. They wanted to know exactly when they're going to get out. So then you started with the sentencing. I use the terms truth in sentencing, and then the Sentencing Commission. And what happened was, instead of having lighter sentences, some of them would get 40 years or life without parole, etc. So it went against, the type of consequences, unintended consequences. So some of them would stay in forever. Now, when I was in the Maryland Penitentiary in the late 70s, somebody 50, 55 years old they kept him in because he did the warden's homework, because he knew something. But they were mostly young, and they didn't stay all that long. They still even had a death penalty then. So what happened, though, is once you had the sentencing commissions, that's when you had what I would say more mass incarceration, because when they were sentenced, they got a minimum, as they call truth in sentencing. So you got more and more people in prison. You had more prisons built, etc. Now, what happened then after that with the prisoners' rights movement, you redefine some of the crimes. An old friend of mine out of Chicago got 20 years in New Mexico for residue of marijuana. Now, the ACLU got him out after 2 years, but right now, I could look outside on 57th Street in New York, and there are people walking down the street smoking joints. And the police are not going to bust them for anything. So basically, they redefined a lot of these crimes that we had in the 60s, 70s, and before down, which also let out a lot of people in prisons. Now, in upstate New York, we had so many prisons, and then they were half filled, and they didn't have the jobs. They wanted the prisons up there to get jobs for the upstate New Yorkers and a lot of the rural areas. Now, after that, we went into all of these different types of programs, more reentry, reintegration, restorative justice, etc. But there are two things that I always did when I taught a PhD course for many, many years on the philosophy of punishment. And the two books I would have them read all the time before they came in were Kant's Metaphysics of Morals and Beccaria's Essay on Crimes and Punishment. Now, Kant was a retributionist. And, you know, if I could just quote 1 second here from him, he says, judicial punishment can never be imposed merely for the purpose of securing some extrinsic good, either of the criminal or of civil society. It must in all cases be imposed and can only be imposed because the individual upon whom it is inflicted has committed an offense. So the penal law is a categorical imperative. And he is to be pitied who slinks through the tortuous maze of utilitarianism in search of some opposing good which may absolve him from punishment or even from the due measure of punishment where justice requires him to be punished. Beccaria took an other view because he believed in deterrence. So but he also said about certainty, severity, etc. And many of the prisoners I know, in comics I know, wanted certainty. When am I going to get out? Now, the point about rehabilitation that I've always taken issue with, which is why I put forlorn hope in the book, is that you cannot foretell the future. Montaigne said it about sincerity. And if you take David Hume, the English philosopher's maxim is that you can never, the problem of induction, you can never tell if the sun is going to come out tomorrow. There is no way. It's come out for millions of years, but we don't know for sure, do we? So you have to go into maybe probability theory, like Bayesianism, and Laplace, the French probabilist, to think that perhaps you're taking a chance on the future because you can never prove anything. So Kant took a backward view. In other words, he is saying you are being punished for a crime. Now, once you finish your punishment, then you go out, you're a free person. There's no parole, there's no probation, whatever. So I still have a feeling when I see all these programs, et cetera, about reintegration, et cetera, which means, of course, these days the jobs are few and far between because of COVID, and they have to have a certain skill to get a job and be placed. Now, what I would say, and one of the most important things comes out of 1844, the Boston Prison Discipline Society. If you see what one of their mottos was, is that besides labor, education or reading is the best thing for a prisoner. Now you look at most prisoners that go in, I think the latest statistic I saw was 70% are illiterate. It's very difficult to go out in this world not able to read. And we know how important degrees are. Not even, they give GREs in prison, but not necessarily college degrees. Now, when I was in the Maryland Penitentiary, it was actually in the 70s. You may talk about mass incarceration, except that they had college programs paid for by the state. And they were packed because one murderer got paroled because he got a BA. So people would take the college programs. Now, in 1994-96, under the Clinton administration, they got rid of Pell Grants because they got Pell Grants for prisoners. They got rid of those. They got rid of the college programs. And they still could get the GREs. So they love to read. They love to go to the library. They read anything. They would always ask me, they call them in the 70s ghetto fiction. Now they call it urban fiction. It took me a while to figure when I saw that term, urban fiction, because of the way we use certain terms these days. So the point is that education probably is the most important thing that you could give a prisoner, literacy. So when you get out, and I agree with Mark about, let's say 20 years, because you will, if you're 60, 70 years old getting out, you're not going to get a job anyway. And most of the prisoners going in are younger and they are illiterate. So I would go back to, what the Boston Prison Discipline Society says. And also, about reading and education. I mean, it's so important. And in the free world, it's so important. If you can't read, if you don't have an education, you're not going to get a job. Now, the other thing is the architecture of the prison. Now, the Maryland Penitentiary was one of those old dungeon types, just like the Eastern Penitentiary and Auburn. It is not conducive, quite frankly, for education, for trying to, I guess I'm not going to say the word rehabilitated, but to get better. So there has been some very, very good, not very good, but prisons that have been built that give you a little better feeling of yourself. The late Norman Johnson from Pennsylvania did a wonderful book on prison architecture. And I think that works a lot. So what I would say is I would say education. I would say maximum sentences of like 20 years. I would give them opportunities. In other words, if you take retribution, you have a set sentence, you get out, you have to give somebody, you have to give a prisoner, an ex-convict, you have to give them an opportunity. You're not going to rehabilitate the person. I think the only program I've seen in all the years I've been in this field is at St. Elizabeth's Hospital many, many years ago when they had like 10 counselors and psychologists working on one person to change his thought around. You're not going to do that with the number of prisoners we have. And we are also at the moment redefining crime, like I said with marijuana. You're not going to get 20 years for a residue, et cetera. So it's all, to me, it's personal agency and it's opportunity and education. And do I have to get two more, John? I think that we have to take into consideration because, we all have good intentions that we want to make prisoners better when they get out. And once again, I'll go back to Hume and his problem of induction. We cannot foresee the future. So if they get in a good education, they learn how to read, they get an opportunity later on. We give them opportunities. And then they can use personal agency to take on these opportunities. And if they don't, they don't. And then once again, we are redefining lots of crime. We're redefining it down. I mean, look at New York City right now. We have a low crime rate because of COVID, but we have a higher murder rate, assault rate, and addiction rate. So there are all kinds of historical contexts and circumstances that we have to look at too. So I don't think, a lot of this is fluid and flexible, but I think the one constant for me at least is the Kantian idea of retribution and personal agency and education and reading. And I'll stop there. All
right, thank you. We appreciate that. And our next, Phil Wheatley. Phil Wheatley is a friend and prison consultant now, but he was leader of Her Majesty's Prison Service and the National Offender Management Service in the United Kingdom for over 7 years before retiring from government service. Phil was the first Director General to have climbed the ranks as a former prison officer. So Phil, I welcome you to the webinar. And you'll need to unmute. There you go.
Right, I'm here, John. Okay.
Thank you.
Right. What I want to do is try to identify what the main harms that I think prison is capable of causing, and then look at how we might minimize them so we do less harm and create rather more good. And I don't want to shy away from talking about the politics of offending and how it's dealt with, because I think that's driving some of the changes that have made prisons more harmful or in danger of making them more harmful. Though our judges may be independent, the framework of how they operate, the rules of the game, the laws, are decided by our governments and our politicians. And politicians' views about crime and punishment are heavily influenced by what they think the public's views are. And in democracies, getting a match between policy on crime and punishment and the public's views is usually seen as a really good vote winner. And it's difficult to get politicians to rise above looking at the short-term votes that might be gained from any particular stance. And you've got to be realistic. Politicians have got to take account of the world in which they operate, in which there's increasing influence from social media, which targets users with content that matches their previous likes and postings. So it will reinforce and not challenge strongly held views. And what gets posted on social media, sort of things that people get excited about, is strongly influenced by broader media coverage, particularly crime stories, which fascinate us. And in the context of a highly competitive battle for market share between different media outlets, Fox News is a pretty good example, the news broadcasters have gone in for what's a cheap way of getting lots of interest, and that's to give lots of sensationalist cover to crime and punishment. So 24-hour media feeding greater attention to what's happening and then amplified on social media is quite likely to create an increased fear amongst the public that there's increased crime about. At the very time that those of us who like data know that really crime in lots of the Western world has been reducing, but it isn't how the public think. And there is obviously crime about it. It's not just gone away, but it's just it isn't as big a problem as people think it is, because of the way it's being amplified. And that public concern has been played out in populist demands, which politicians have chosen to accede to for tougher and longer sentences. And it doesn't matter whether that belief in greater retribution and confidence that that will lead to deterrence doesn't have a lot of evidence behind it. It's what people think. And certainly from an administration point of view, somebody who ran the prison service, I couldn't decide what public policy was on dealing with crime and punishment. I was a jailer. I was a person organizing jails. I didn't do it myself, but I had to deal with the people who were sent to me by the court, so I could have a view on the public policy, but it wasn't mine to change. And so as a prison administrator, you've got to adjust to the reality of what's happening in sentencing. And it seems to me that that pressure, that populist pressure, creates two very different sorts of pressure, which create a risk of harm. Because I probably should also draw attention to the fact there is another driver, which does get some public support. The public do seem to expect that we, people who work in prison, will be able to prevent further offending. But there must be some magic way of doing that. And so quite a lot of the publicity also gets concentrated on the failure by offenders to be rehabilitated. We've just seen that in the UK with a couple of high-profile terrorist offences committed by people who've been in prison, which is seen as a failure of the prison service, not a failure of the individuals, because we should have been able to prevent it. So there's pressure to reduce reoffending, and the pressure to be tougher and to have longer sentences often makes it even more difficult to reduce reoffending, which is already very difficult, as Larry has pointed out. It's not dead easy. I think it can be done. I'm not as pessimistic as he is, but it's not an easy task. So for me, the likely response to a tougher rhetoric, apart from longer sentences, is a desire to have tougher prisons, and tougher prisons usually means greater lockdown. It also means greater lockdown, and when they're out of their cells, it means direct supervision by a disciplinarian motivated staff. So there'll be very limited time out of cell. It will be very restrictive. Staff will be expected to be on top of misbehavior in a disciplinarian role. And we know that deliberately tough prisons that have a lot of lockdown and very tough supervision when prisoners are out, that's not particularly caring, it's just rule enforcement, is, as Larry's already pointed out, that's exactly what happened in the 19th century. It's what both the separate and the silent system produced. And it got to people. It's very difficult to do a long-term imprisonment and remain sane. And I'm interested in prison history as well. So the English model prison was at Pentonville. And they started with a very tough regime built on the silent system. Prisoners kept separate, not allowed to speak to each other. So separate system as well as silent, I suppose. The only person who reformed it was the chaplain and going to church. And the Victorians started that and said, I think originally it was 2.5 years you were going to spend in those conditions. And they found that people actually went mad. And the Victorians went namby-pamby, but they couldn't stand that degree of damage to prisoners and began to water down the system and reduce by half the amount of time that people spent in it. So we've known for years that if we run those sort of very rigid regimes, they're bad for people's mental health. And that's not entirely surprising because we all know, those of us who've worked in prison, that the people who end up with us, because of the way that rule enforcement is done, because of the attraction of crime in communities where making it in successful society doesn't look like much of an option, but you're far more likely to get involved in crime. You've got mental health problems. You come from a deprived background. You've got poor educational attainment. If you've lived in a bit of the world where it was very difficult to see how you could be successful. So we end up looking after people who've got lots of problems. And certainly mental health problems and addiction problems are rife in the UK prisons population of the moment. But the other option for managing the fact that you've got much longer sentences and a rising prison population, because that's what the longer sentences have been driving, the fact that we've seen in the UK the same extension of sentences, greater use of indeterminate sentences with absolutely no end in them, and longer determinate sentences, we've about doubled our prison population simply by increasing the time that each individual spends in the prison. It's not we've actually increased the number of people we've locked up, we just lock them up for longer. That means we need a bigger storehouse to put them in. And doing that's expensive because doing it and allowing a degree of liberty for prisoners and some opportunities to do positive things requires supervision. Supervision equals staff, and staff are expensive. So it's very tempting for politicians who don't want to do lockdown because they know that damages people, but who therefore want some regime to do it on the cheap. And doing it on the cheap, it's very easy to create far too lax a regime in which you supervise prisoners from a distance, often from behind barriers, behind a fence, behind bars. You use high-tech equipment, you point cameras at people to interact with them, and you intervene when things go obviously wrong. But for most of the time, you've actually got prisoners in relatively unregulated association, only facing intervention when things go extremely wrong. And that's a very, very dangerous world in which to leave prisoners because you simply allow the existing street culture to be amplified. Because prisoners in effect not being supervised, they're out of their cells, they mix with each other and they become, they settle in their gangs. And I know see that in a number of prisons in the USA. You've certainly seen it in our prisons that locked up terrorists. The Northern Irish Prison Service had that as a main feature. Prisoners were held depending on which political terrorist group they belonged to, alongside their fellow terrorists. So they recreated their command structure inside the prison. And it made it very difficult for staff to get any sort of actual cooperation from prisoners. So creating too lax a regime that's lightly supervised holding prisoners for a long time will drive them into their criminal behavior inside and reinforce whatever criminal behavior they're likely to do. They will come out with new skills and a greater allegiance to their criminal activities. And for those who are weak and in difficulties, it's a very frightening place, because violence is how order is imposed by prisoners on prisoners, because the staff aren't really doing it. And you meet prison governors, prison wardens who speak about their murder rate. And I think when we begin to speak about our murder rate in prisons, we're demonstrating clearly we haven't got control of them. And that's usually because we've got these sort of lax regimes with lots of mixing, but very few staff. So I'm interested in how do we minimize those harms, and how do we cope with the pressure to be tougher, to reduce reoffending, but do it in a way that doesn't harm people. And we know from some recent research in the UK, done by the Cambridge Institute of Criminology, Alison Liebling and Catherine Orty, that both reoffending is reduced and harmful behaviour in prison is reduced, violence and indiscipline and self-harm, in prisons where prisoners feel safe, feel they're treated fairly, and which offer positive opportunities to improve and learn. Learning is important, and I'm with Larry on that. I think access to education is pretty powerful, but it needs more than that. Prisons have to ensure there's decent and lawful treatment of their prisoners, and they do that by providing a sufficient variety of positive activity, opportunities to mix with other prisoners, opportunities to do positive things, but all of which are well enough supervised to be safe. They've got to provide adequate treatment and support for the physical, mental and psychological health of their prisoners, taking account of the fact we've got lots of damaged people with real mental health problems and lots of addiction problems that do need support. They can't be just ignored. Prisoners need the opportunity for contact outside the prison. They've got to think about more than just being in prison. And so making sure they can maintain contact with non-criminal and potentially supportive family and friends. I'm not saying let's introduce them to all the people they work with outside when they were in crime, but most offenders have got family who desperately don't want them to be involved in crime and would rather like them out of it. And we need to be facilitating all those positive contacts and allowing that to happen inside. And that success, running that sort of prison, I think, requires that prison staff of all grades, from the warden or governor downwards, have to treat prisoners in a way that's consistent with the principles of decency and fairness, not capriciously, not bad-temperedly, not waking up one day and thinking I'll be nice to people and the next day thinking no, I've had a bad night, I'll just abuse people. People have got to be consistent and fair in everything they do. The regime has to be clear and predictable. Not happens one day and it doesn't happen the next. That winds people up. So you're trying not to create a situation where you're giving prisoners grievances, because actually what you promise to do doesn't happen regularly. Prisoners have to have clarity about how decision making is done, so do staff. Who can take what decision? What are the rules of the place? Again, they want to be clear and relatively simple, and decision taking has to be fair, prompt and consistent. Putting people in promised land, I know from my days in prisons, and I worked a long time in prisons over a number of years, nothing worse than saying, oh, I'll sort that out for you, and then never doing it. You've got to be absolutely consistent. If you say you're going to do something, you've got to do it. And you have to be prepared to explain the thinking behind decisions, because that encourages people to think it's fair. It's important that decisions aren't influenced by staff having favourites. Watch that. And it's particularly important that prisoners don't get things by threatening and wheedling, because that's unfair. Other prisoners see it. So the person who's promised a good job because they promise they'll behave if they get a good job, that's a bribe. That's not a reward for being good. That's effectively getting away with threatening to be bad if I don't get a job. So trying to make sure that you are genuinely rewarding people who behave well, and you aren't succumbing to the pressure from prisoners to do something with an implied threat in it, it's crucial. And that sort of prison has to have an approach to security and control that's proportionate to the risks. If you're looking after gang members or terrorists, the risks are different from if you're looking after minor burglars. What are they likely to do? What are they likely to smuggle in? What's their track record on violence? That all requires a different approach, but it has to be consistent with the risks, not over the top, so that you're putting elaborate security measures in you don't need. Has to be no tolerance of criminal activity, and that includes violence and drug use inside. I think if you begin to accede to it, say it's all right, yeah, we don't mind a bit of cannabis use, we turn the blind eye to it, you begin to undermine the sense that this is a fair place. And so you have to be straight about trying to make sure you're running a straight place, and you have to be on top of disorder and deal with it, hence supervision needing to be right. And success requires sufficient staff and engaged staff, not just rule followers, but you need confident people with good social skills who have a genuine but realistic interest in prisoners, but aren't soft. They've got to be able to use authority, and they've got to be prepared to set boundaries, and they need to be resilient in doing that. But while at the same time being prepared to listen and understand a prisoner's point of view. Now you can find people like that. They don't necessarily have degrees. They don't necessarily have lots of qualifications. Many of them will have plenty of good life experience, but you've got to work hard to select the right people. And from a senior management perspective, looking back as an administrator, that means that the way you recruit staff becomes crucial. You've got to make sure you know what you're looking for, make sure you get the right mix of people and you retain them. It's necessary once you've recruited staff to actually train them well and support them well. It's difficult work you're asking them to do. So they need encouraging and supporting to do it. You need to try and form cohesive staff teams. So staff just don't work as individuals. They become part of a team that works cooperatively. And that means detailing people to the same place regularly enough and having good quality senior managers and first line managers who themselves need support and training. And staff of all grades, I think, need to put emphasis on recognising and praising good work, rather than simply intervening when things go wrong, which we're terribly inclined to do in prison, which just generates a blame culture. So I'd emphasise saying to staff, when they've done something well, when they've handled a difficult situation well, not exceptional stuff, not just when they saved somebody's life, but just the daily good work, that we're there, we recognise it and we encourage it and reward it by praise and recognition. And from a senior management point of view, you've got to do careful planning and realistic resourcing of anything you try and do, so that your plans, when you say, well, we're going to open a new workshop, it's got to really work. It's got to have work in it. It's got to be properly equipped. You've got to have thought it through. And it won't do just as politicians sometimes do, to make an announcement and then hope that everybody else will find a way of muddling it through for you. So I'm looking for managers who've got a grip and make sure that things are actually capable of happening because they've done their job properly. Now, if you put all that lot together, you've got a just prison with lots of positive activity in it, where you're controlling the potential for bad behaviour and you're allowing prisoners to think about the future. I think we can minimise the risk of harm that comes from locking people up for a very long time, and will be inevitable if we leave them in too lax a place, or if we run a rigid, tough punishment regime where we'll turn out prisoners who hate the world and are reinforced in their criminal behaviour. Thanks very much.
Hey, thank you very much, Phil. The Dr. Kenneth Ray has a diverse career that many of us would envy. He served as a law enforcement officer and executive for over 30 years, and a practicing mental health clinician for 10 years. He's a federal court-appointed corrections civil rights monitor and an inmate health and custody auditor for several jails in Georgia and Illinois. His passions include helping policymakers implement durable reforms that balance best care and protection of inmates with staff wellness and safety. Ken?
Thank you, John. And thank all of the viewers today, for taking time to participate. I'm a bit humbled and blessed to participate on a panel with so many distinguished experts, and I'm enjoying listening to everything everyone's saying, and I appreciate that input and the ideas that it's giving me in the work that I do. I'm going to be relatively brief because I know that we need time for questions, but I want to focus on jails. And the reason I want to focus on jails, and even though I do some prison work, is that not everybody who goes to jail goes to prison. In fact, the vast majority of people who have gone to jails throughout our nation's history, and probably the same in other countries, do not go to prison. So everybody who's in prison, who's gone to prison, has gone to jail. So when we talk about implementing reforms and looking at the concept of community wellness, minimizing harm and balancing harm with public safety, I think, well, in my area, I'm going to focus on jails. And the reason for that is that I think is where the greatest harm begins and where the harm is then transferred back into the community, as well as the prisons, until an inmate is stabilized in a prison structure. And what I'm going to do is briefly salt what I share with you with 40 plus years of experience in the social system, as well as a few examples of some very interesting and creative and measurably effective reforms that I've either been a part of or I've learned about. So when we talk about jails, it's important in creating or reducing the harm that a jail can cause. I think it's important to look at the outcomes. And so in a lot of the communities that I work with, so if I'm doing a jail study, a reform study, or if I'm monitoring a consent order for civil rights restoration of prisoners, I look at the organization sort of through a organizational psychologist lens. I'm not an organizational psychologist, I'm a behavioral health doctor. But I look at it from that view. And the first thing I look for is this an organization that is about who's right or what's right? Are they an organization about how we can or why we can't? And you can draw the conclusions that an organization that is a who's right and why we can't is going to have extreme difficulty making changes or even understanding the idea of value-added justice, because they tend to be myopic and there's only one way or the highway. But we all know in human behavior, it's not that simple. And in trying to satisfy the balance between public safety and community wellness, it's not that simple. So I think if we look at jails and look at the volume of people that go through the jails in the United States, 11 to 12 plus million a year, and Larry probably has a better number on that with your experience and your study, it's an extremely high number of people that can and are harmed simply from the experience of arrest to incarceration. Now, remember, I'm a retired police officer, and so I'm a law and order person, and I'm very victim supportive, and I do not minimize the consequences that offending has caused to victims and the harm that causes as well. So I think part of the conversation when we talk about value-added justice is, are we also including the harm that has been caused to victims, which in many cases is permanent and has to be dealt with. But when we're looking at an organization that has risen or exists as a how we can and what is right, we're talking about an organization, I think like Philip was talking about, that is healthy, and an organization that promotes possibilities, and an organization that listens to its community. And I think that's one of the key issues, is listening to your community and matching the values of jail operations to community desired outcomes. So the first thing I want to point I want to make is when we're designing or considering value-added justice and minimizing harm, I think we want to back up and ask ourselves and include our community in a conversation that says, what outcomes do you want to occur from incarceration? And maybe that's far-fetched, but I've done several studies and research or surveys in communities where I've done jail reform work, and that's what we do. We develop, 4 simple questions. We ask the community, we ask the criminal justice constituency, we ask the stakeholders, and ironically, they all say the same thing. The community, ultimately, in the jurisdictions that I've worked with, want the same outcomes. They want public safety. They want a safe place for people to be incarcerated. They want inmates to be treated with respect. They also want them, and this is a consensus among the justice as well as the greater community, they want folks to leave jails less likely to reoffend. Well, what does that mean? And how do we get there? Okay, so there is one aspect of value-added justice, and it speaks to and informs what do we do before we incarcerate, what do we do when we incarcerate and during incarceration, and what do we do to prepare folks for reintegration or post-release? And is there continuity in our justice system practices? So outcomes, I think, is the first thing to look at when we're talking about value-added justice. What is it we're trying to minimize or stop? What is it we're trying to maximize and grow? I'll use a healthcare example. There's considerable research growing, and I've seen it in my own practice, that demonstrates that the jail or a jail's healthcare delivery model has a direct and significant impact on the public health system. So what I'm saying is the better or more effective that a jail's healthcare system is, the less impact it's going to have on the community's public health system, a system that's already burdened by a large number of needs in the community. So if we look at, I'll give you an example of a jurisdiction I'm working with right now, is to improve their healthcare delivery model, reduce, something as simple as reducing the patients or the inmates' A1C levels while they're in jail and educate them on how to live a healthier lifestyle, reduces the negative impact on the resources that are needed for others in the community, maybe who didn't offend. So looking at outcomes from a 40,000 foot level all the way, to the weeds is important. So you want to focus on the outcomes that the community wants. To do that, I think it's important to look at the consequences that our justice systems have created for our community in terms of community wellness. To start with, I've seen in my 40 years of work in this business as well as consulting, the silo effect can be devastating to trying to create continuity of justice and trying to create a plan or a reform program where all of the system components are contributing to and focused on the same healthy outcomes in justice that the community wants. In part, there's political issues. In part, there's legal, challenges. In part, there's the egos of a system trying to work together to create an outcome. Now, could you imagine going to a hospital or expecting to have to go to a hospital that has the recidivism rate that we have in the United States, 60, 70%? I wouldn't go there. To me, it's the same as a jail. If something can't be done by the criminal justice system as a community to reduce the likelihood that that person is going to come back and not focus only on the punitive control of the person's life choices that we use, I don't think we're going to get the value-added justice that we want. How we can, however, is if we focus rather than on, in addition to outcomes, we focus on community wellness, because that's a different paradigm. Our focus in the United States, and I think most countries, is public safety first. And I don't take issue with that. I wore a badge for a lot of years in a police car, and that was my job, from writing tickets to slow people down to making arrests for domestic violence. But my point is this: if our focus is only on public safety and primarily on public safety, I think there's a risk that we forget about the idea of community wellness. And I would suggest that we would reverse that, that we look at, we put our focus of justice back on community wellness, or to community wellness, not that we've ever done that primarily, because that I believe that includes public safety. When we look at community wellness, we look at it all the way downstream, right? We're going to look at what's the consequence to our community for this justice decision. And how will this justice decision impact not just this person in public safety, but how will it affect the wellness of everybody who's impacted by our decision today? Incarceration for things that are unnecessary, in my opinion. In the late 70s, I was a police officer. I know I don't look near that old, but I was. I was a police officer in a very liberal Northwest state. And in 1979, don't waste your time trying to get an ounce of marijuana in the court. It's not going to happen. So as a police officer, it's like, okay, just dump it, using discretion. Things have changed since then somewhat. My point is that by making that arrest, it's important to understand what's the consequence of that arrest versus an alternative option than arrest. Arrest has always been the default of the system. Arrest and let the system deal with it. I would disagree with that. I would say that's the first point at which we diagnose and assess the need to even invoke the criminal justice system into a situation. Unfortunately, we don't have all of the resources in most communities to divert the person to something other than the criminal justice system. Because once the person gets into the criminal justice system, that can be a lifelong, that can have a lifelong impact. When a person is incarcerated, what we have to think about, what's the impact on the person's family? I'd like to see research on the volume of families that have been impacted by arrest to the point that it has resulted in single parenting. There is research that's very clear that says certain communities have a higher prevalence of children who have involved themselves in a criminal justice system or have been involved because their parents were involved. And I think these are glimpses that we have to take a very close look at to understand what we mean by community wellness and how do we minimize the harm that our system does, and that's all components of our system. And how do we shore up and support community systems that contribute to better personal outcomes for people, to reduce their risk to become involved. So the third point I would make, first is let's look at what are the outcomes we really want to create, and do they support a value-added justice model? Second is, I really believe we should reframe our understanding of the criminal justice purpose as a community wellness delivery system. And last, I'm going to go into the weeds a little bit, is it's important to remember that people, I don't have a high percent, I don't know what the percentage is, but I know it's high, come into contact after years of trauma. So their life experiences trauma has been virtually baked into their life and baked into their existence. And there's an enormous body of research that dates back 4 decades at least that talks about this. You can look at the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences, the research in prisons and jails. You can see that there is an extraordinarily high prevalence of people who have had high incidence of trauma in their life end up in the criminal justice system. And I think it's important to keep that in mind because that informs us about how we need to understand our role as criminal justice practitioners and how we need to and why we need to embrace a different collaborative approach to delivering justice with our community and expanding the table of who is part of our criminal justice delivery decision making. And I'll end with that, when we're looking at a value-added model, I think it's important to begin with deciding what those outcomes are. And do those outcomes align with a vision we want for our community to be healthier and to be better? The second is to put our focus on community wellness, define that for our communities and what that means, but define it from a larger voice, not just a few politicians and a few criminal justice leaders, but a larger voice into the community. And then third, I think it's important simply because the size of the issue in the criminal justice system is to take a more serious look and a more compassionate look at the issue of trauma when it comes to determining what prescriptions we're going to use to address criminal behavior in our community wellness. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to do something different during this pandemic rather than I've been digging holes and planting flowers. So I've enjoyed listening to everybody, and I thank you all for allowing me to participate.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ray. Well, folks, we covered a lot of topics today, covered a lot of ground. We had a variety of viewpoints, I would say, an excellent webinar. In a moment, I'll put up a slide with the Global Justice Resource contact information and my contact information. But at this point, I just want to thank all of our presenters today. Mark Maurer from the Sentencing Project, Larry Sullivan from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, Phil Wheatley from the UK, Ken Ray from RJS Justice Services in Ashland, Kentucky, and my dear friend and the Global Justice Resource Center's biggest supporter, Dr. Uju Agomo. So I want to thank everybody for participating, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. So if there's any way that I or the Global Justice Resource Center can be of any assistance to you, please let me know. Thank you, folks.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Stay in touch. Bye for now.
Bye.
John, bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you very much for this. I think we should do it again. This is great. Thank you, Dr. Gannon, for putting up this wonderful piece. Thank you very much.